This is the story of the largest structures the world had ever seen, the amazing longhouses of Neolithic Europe. But then from around 5500 BC, from a small area of the Starchevo culture, a new kind of culture developed in what's modern Western Hungary today. These people developed new ways of life and new farming methods, perhaps developing strains of barley and other crops that were adapted to northern environmental conditions, while dropping other crop types like chickpea from their repertoire entirely. And they developed new longhouses and settlement types. They also developed new decorated pottery types, the pottery that gives this culture its modern name, the linear pottery culture, commonly known as the LBK, after their German name linear band ceramic. Soon after 5500 BC, they suddenly expanded, first from Transdanubia to Slovakia, Austria, Moravia, Bohemia and central and eastern Germany within just 100 years or so. And then around 5300 BC, a second wave of expansion reached the Paris Basin and adjacent areas of France as far west as Normandy, and in the east reached as far as modern Poland, Ukraine, Moldova and Romania. Social innovations developed here in Transdanubia in about 5500 BC, but one idea, supported by new ancient DNA evidence, is that it was stimulated by mixing with the local hunter-gatherer population. When the Neolithic farmers spread through the Balkans, Europe was already inhabited by European hunter-gatherers, a population sometimes called WHG, for Western hunter-gatherer, by geneticists. The ecological zones the farmers were interested in were not those especially exploited by the hunter-gatherers, so there wasn't necessarily much competition for resources or direct contact everywhere. It's thought that small groups of hunter-gatherers lived parallel lives in the same regions as the colonising farmers spread out. Nevertheless, there were interactions and many admixture events. We see partial WHG ancestry in LBK people from some of the earliest LBK settlements. These early LBK people averaged 11% WHG ancestry, but could be as high as 35 or even 50%, meaning in that case that person had one farmer parent and one hunter-gatherer parent. And limited WHG admixture continued to occur with LBK groups over the centuries, apparently from both men and women joining these farming societies. And this 2024 DNA study suggests this admixture with local hunter-gatherers could have played a key part in the formation of the LBK culture, or at least was one way they differentiated themselves from their ancestral societies. The extent of the hunter-gatherer influence on this new society is hard to say, but we do know this new way of life was different from what came before, and it was also enormously successful. Like all Neolithic cultures though, their way of life enabled far greater population sizes than hunter-gatherer societies could maintain, and the WHG genetic component typically remained correspondingly small, averaging about 5%. The LBK birth rate was high, and settlements were quickly outgrown, and the next generation moved on to colonise new virgin lands in succession, driving these two waves of expansions across Europe. New family groups set out to establish new settlements, bringing their domesticated plants and animals with them, while also hunting wild animals and gathering wild resources. Interestingly, early LBK people favoured cattle and did more hunting, while later on, before their decline and collapse around 5000 BC, they tended to favour pigs and hunted less. Their cattle not only provided meat and hides, but manuring their fields helped these settlements thrive for generations, and they milked their cows too. I really love that they used these ceramic sieves to separate curds from whey for cheese making. Europeans have been enjoying dairy products for at least 7,500 years. Settlements varied in size. The largest could have 40 to 50 longhouses and perhaps 300 to 400 people. Others though might have just one large longhouse with 2 or 3 smaller ones nearby. The longhouses had a fairly consistent width of between 5.5 to 7 metres, which is 18 to 23 feet. The lengths though could vary considerably. They range from between just 10 metres or 32 feet to an enormous and rare 50 metres or 160 feet. I think just 5% or so were this big. Probably the houses in the range between 15 to 30 metres or 50 to 100 feet long were the most common. We're all quite familiar today with the idea of these kinds of buildings. We might think of Viking longhouses, the Germanic mead hall of the early medieval era, and we're used to the idea of large domestic buildings where we live permanently with our family, surrounded by plots for growing crops and areas beyond for grazing our animals. It's so familiar you might assume it's how people always lived. But 7,500 years ago, these buildings and the farmstead or village way of life were an astounding innovation, and their houses were the largest buildings in the world. They were monumental structures that formed the physical and conceptual heart of the community. They were foundational to the society. And again, that might seem obvious, but in fact, houses need not be so central to successful Neolithic societies. Plenty of others before and after lived in smaller, more temporary structures, like in late Neolithic Ireland, or focused more on the collective settlement as a whole, becoming a unifying monument at tell sites. The LBK might be named after its pottery, but they'd be better defined by their buildings. These longhouses tended to be oriented in the same way, generally northwest to southeast, with the doorways tending to be on the southeast end, although some might have had a door on the long side. They often had ditches dug along the outside walls, presumably for drainage or collecting water shedding off the roof, and might have been dug originally to provide clay for the wattle and daub walls. Most sites appear in the archaeological record as post holes, along with ditches and pits, but very few original house floors survive. It might be the ancient floors have been ploughed away by later farming, or the original house floors might have been suspended on piles above the ground surface. Some of the LBK longhouses were not rectangular but were more trapezoidal, narrowing at the northern end. But they tended to have the same kind of modular structure and similar kinds of internal organisation. The huge posts forming the frame of the building supported the roof and also formed internal divisions. The large houses were separated into up to 3 sections: the southern front part, the central part, and the northern part at the rear. Archaeologists have reconstructed how they were used largely by the different finds associated with each part, seeing sections for living and sleeping, working and food storage, and others for stabling animals. Some houses likely had a raised second floor for sleeping or food storage. Finds suggest working areas where the men produced and maintained their stone tools, and where the women made pottery and did the grinding of grain to make flour. We know they had sex-differentiated economic roles because of their sex-differentiated burials. Men were often buried with their tools like polished stone adzes that they used for woodworking, clearing land and building longhouses, and for killing their enemies. And women were buried with pottery and grinding stones, as well as personal ornaments like shell beads and pendants. From testing human remains for chemical signatures that show where they grew up, researchers have demonstrated that men, at least men of high status, tended to stay in the regions they were born in all their lives, being buried where they grew up, while women were more mobile, moving to new areas during their lives. This suggests patrilocal organisation and female exogamy, where men inherit the lands of their forefathers and marry women from other areas. Each longhouse was apparently a self-contained social and economic unit. This was where an extended family lived, worked and stored their food, and perhaps stabled their animals. But not all houses in one community were the same. There was inequality within settlements. For example, a study on LBK settlements in a valley in northwest France found the largest houses focused on growing grain and herding cattle and sheep, while the smallest houses focused on hunting boar and deer and making hides. And the middle-sized houses did a bit of both. This suggests a hierarchy of lineages or groups within these societies, with the wealthiest controlling access to grain plots and grazing land. No doubt they exchanged their produce in a mutually beneficial way, but it's hard to imagine the smaller houses as anything but subservient to the larger ones. These massive structures not only served to store wealth, whether in grain or animals or people, but the houses were monumental declarations of power too. And it's possible their size, housing many men, and the limited entrances also served as a deterrent to potential tribal violence. Some believe the large size of the houses developed from a kind of competition between rival groups, each trying to outdo the other, until some reached these enormous sizes. There was also a hierarchy between sites, with some large ones maybe forming an ancestral power base with many smaller settlements in its orbit. Houses seem to have stood for a generation or so, maybe 30 years at most, before being abandoned and new houses being built nearby. Some people think the long houses were abandoned when the head of the household died. The ruins of the former houses might stand unused, or at least the area where they had once stood was left alone, as if respecting its memory and that of the people who had lived there. Later LBK groups increasingly began building large ditched enclosures. Some see these as defensive in nature, others see them as ritual meeting centres, or at least demonstrating a new kind of concentrated social structure. But the massive success of the LBK could not last. Sometime after 5100 BC, there may have been a slight climatic downturn, the soils might have been exhausted by over-farming, and the population density might have reached a critical mass, leading to intensifying competition for remaining resources. There is evidence for disruption in long-range networks, population decline, and a terrible crisis. Clustered around 5000 BC, there is evidence for widespread, large-scale massacres. There was always intergroup violence in LBK society, likely blood feuds and raiding for cattle and to abduct women, that kind of thing. But now whole settlements, even many settlements in a single event, seem to have been massacred, people being shot by arrows and clubbed on the head with axes and adzes, and the bodies being dumped into ditches or pits. Some of these massacre sites have a distinct lack of women and girls, suggesting they were carried off by the victors. Eventually, the cycle of violence came to an end, along with the LBK culture. After 5000 BC, new societies emerged in various regions across what had been the LBK territory, distinct from the LBK, but carrying various elements of their ancestral society forward into the future. Some societies kept building longhouses, but they were no longer constrained by the rules governing the sizes, shapes and organisation of the LBK ones. The most notable society for me is the Cucuteni Tripilia culture that emerged in the east after 5000 BC. They eventually built the largest settlements that the world had ever seen, made up of thousands of longhouses and tens of thousands of people. And notably, in some places like Northern Europe, there was a genetic and cultural resurgence of the local hunter-gatherers. For centuries during the LBK era, some hunter-gatherer groups had quietly thrived in coastal regions and wetlands beyond the reach of the LBK, and now they would emerge and assert their influence, even dominance, over the battered survivors, in some places completely replacing the LBK male lineages with their own.